Hi, everybody. Welcome to Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. Today, we're going to look at the X Fighters. I know that sounds like a TV show out of the early 60s, but this was a very special breed of airplane in a magical era of late 1940s, early 50s flight test. Now, when we say X Fighters, are we talking about X planes? No, that was a separate family of very unique aircraft. You can see here in the what I call a family portrait. These were dedicated flight test research aircraft designed exclusively to probe the frontiers of flight in speed, altitude, thermal regimes, with the exception of the XF-92 that you see at top left. All these airplanes were very unique, built either one of a kind, two or three at the most, and used for very, very specific experimental test purposes only, never intended to go into production. There are two versions of the X Fighters. There's the X designation applied to an airplane that is a experimental prototype of a new type testing a new regime of flight. In this case, the Lockheed Salmon vertical takeoff and landing turboprop fighter, never intended for production. It was just testing the concept. And then you've got the X fighter that is the first of a breed of what will become a very successful line of aircraft like the XP-86 Sabre that you see here. The Y designation refers to prototype also, but this is a different, slightly different variation. Here we have the YF-96 Thunderstreak. This is Republic's first swept-wing version of the F-84 Thunder jet, but due to budget restrictions and some political issues, there was not funding for a new airplane, so it was redesignated as the F-84F Thunderstreak. So let's take a look at some of these X fighters and see what they were all about. These first two are Navy airplanes that are called tail sitters, and this is the Convair Pogo and the Lockheed Salmon, designed to explore the possibility of a shipboard vertical takeoff and landing turboprop interceptor. They both flew, and they were never put into production. It was just not a totally successful concept. The Douglas Skyray was the first delta wing carrier-based aircraft, set world speed records. Very unique airplane for the Douglas Company. The Convair Sea Dart was the delta wing supersonic flying boat. And the Martin Seamaster was a strategic bomber that was also could be based on any ocean in the world and was serviced by submarines, but the Air Force took over that mission. So of all the airplanes I just showed you, the only one that went into production was the Douglas Skyray. And this was the first supersonic jet airplane, I should say, for the Douglas Aircraft Company. I would like to go back and talk about one of the dedicated X planes. That's the X-13. And the reason I chose this is because in many of my presentations, I'm always asked questions by folks that may not be familiar with this subject, and they'll say, why would they build these odd-looking, bizarre-shaped airplanes that were never intended to go into production? And the answer is very simple. This was an era in which the airplanes were built and flown and evaluated. They learned from them. Some were lost in accidents. Hopefully the pilots got out. It was just a pioneering era where they decided to build these machines to see if they would work. They learned what worked, what didn't, and they moved on, which improved aviation forever. The X-13 concept was to have a jet, eventually become a jet fighter, but a jet mounted on a truck that could be driven anywhere in the country for mobilization. Look at the exhaust. You can see the vernier vectored thrust exhaust cone there. And the idea was that the truck would go vertical and the jet would start up and back away from the truck and accelerate vertically and then launch into horizontal flight. The X-13 reached nearly 600 miles an hour. It was a very successful airplane. Two were built by the Ryan Company in San Diego. Both survive to this day. One of them was driven back to Washington, D.C. and put on a flight demonstration in the parking lot of the Pentagon in Washington. I have a very dear friend who was a young boy at the time, and his dad took him down to see it. He said it was the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life. But here's the beginning. This is the first, what we call designated X plane that became a fighter anyway, the XP-59 era Comet. First flew in 1942, was America's first military jet aircraft. Lockheed came up with the brilliant XP-80 Shooting Star, first flew in 1944, right at the end of the war. This is the Gray Ghost with pilot Tony LeVere in the cockpit. The Republic Thunderjet XP-84, and you notice that these are P designations, the original World War II Pursuit, and this changed to F for fighter after the Air Force became a separate branch of the service in September of 1947. The McDonnell XF-85 was what they call a parasite fighter. You see it here, that's not the landing gear, that's a ground handling dolly. This airplane was designed to be carried in a B-29 or a B-50, and it would be the bomber's own escort fighter carried aloft, and then it would go out and defend the bomber fleet, and then come in and land on a skid that would be mounted on that little bracket that you see below the nose air intake. Notice also the 4 gun ports that are covered over there on the upper section of the nose. The North American XP-86, this is Ship 1, the Air Force's first swept wing fighter, a legendary airplane in its own right. The Lockheed XF-90 was the first of 3 studies from 3 different companies for what was called the 1954 Interceptor. This was a heavy, powerful Cold War interceptor that could defend the country and carry missiles. In this case, we see a bomb load. But the XF-90 was the first. Second was the Republic XF-91 Thunder Scepter, seen here at Edwards. And third was the Convair Delta Wing XF-92, America's first Delta Wing aircraft. I chose one of the Lockheed, one of the Century Series airplanes, Lockheed F-104, which was the only Century Series to be designated as an XF airplane from the beginning. So what happened? What actually was the legacy of these machines? Let's take a look. The P-80 went on to become the Shooting Star used in the Korean War, and of course the legendary T-33 jet trainer. And ultimately the F-94 series, here we see the F-94C Starfire jet interceptor, first Air Force airplane to be equipped with an afterburner. The P-84 began the long line of Republic Thundercraft, as they were called. And here's the takeoff, first flew in 1944. Many of you know that my uncle was associated with the company. He was with them for 32 years as a chief designer. And he always told a wonderful story about the F-84. He said, this is an airplane that Republic engineers were literally writing the book on how to design the airplane as they were designing the airplane. The J-35 engine was problematic in those days. A great story is one of the engineers from Edwards called Farmingdale, and he said, look, this engine is catching fire, it's blowing up, it burns a lot of gas. I'll tell you one thing, a jet engine's never going to be used in an airliner. But the 84 went on to, again, be part of the Korean War fleet, the F-84G that you see here. This evolved into the F-84F Thunder Streak, as we saw earlier. And the most successful of the Thunderjet, Thunderstreak family, the RF-84F Thunder Flash Photo Recon version. But here we have something very interesting. The 84 has the distinction of being the only airplane that began and ended as an XF designated X-fighter. This is the XF-84H Thunder Screech, as it was nicknamed. The idea was to have a turboprop powered supersonic propeller with a jet exhaust augmented for thrust. And this was, again, a test bed, the General Electric T-40 turboprop. I'm sorry, the Allison T-40 turboprop. And the idea was just to explore enhanced performance of a turboprop airplane. Several other machines were fitted with this concept. It ultimately did not work. The airplane barely made 600 miles an hour, and the noise produced was formidable and really a problem. It made a total of 11 flights. All 11 flights ended in an emergency landing. So this points out that these airplanes were built and tested. Some worked, some did not. They learned and they moved on. But here we see the Thunder Screech in flight. That little triangular dorsal fin up there behind the cockpit is a unique feature of the airplane as well. The XF-85 was flown. It was tested with a B-29, not a very successful program, but the idea of the FICON, the fighter conveyor, is that the bomber would carry its own escort. This was rendered obsolete when jet bombers came in, the B-47, B-52. SAC did have their own fighter escort aircraft, but again, the bombers went on to their own. And as we see here, these tests were successful, but ultimately not put into operation. The F-86 was the first in a long line of excellent North American fighters. See the production F-86 Sabre, veteran of the Korean War, the F-86D, early 50s Cold War interceptor, and the F-100 Super Sabre, America's first operational supersonic airplane. The XF-91, an interesting airplane. In this view, it looks pretty much like an F-84 Thunderjet on steroids, but check it out from above. It's an inverse tapered wing. The idea would be that it would delay the stall at the wingtip. And you can see here the guys in the hazmat suits are refueling the XLR-11 rocket engine that is mounted underneath the tail. And that allowed this airplane to become the first aircraft to attain Mach 1 in level flight in 1951. So again, this brings up the question, why would they build an airplane that looked like this, was never intended to be go into production? What was the point? And the point was the learning curve. The high-speed regime that this airplane explored, the advanced systems, the advanced structures, provided Republic with the bridge from the F-84 to the F-105. The XF-92, in a class by itself, Convair engineers developed the Delta Wing fighter. This became the F-102. Here we see the YF-102, but this was a barrel fuselage Delta Wing airplane that just had underwhelming performance, and the secret was the area rule fuselage that was applied to the YF-102A seen here. And this went on to become the F-102A for all you Steve Canyon fans. The tail is taller, and this was the Air Force's first dedicated supersonic jet interceptor. Last of the breed for Convair was the brilliant F-106 Delta Dart, the fastest of the Century series at Mach 2.41 during a world record attempt. And the longest lived of the Air Force Century series, this flew in operation as a frontline ADC interceptor well into the 1980s. The F-104, the XF-104 seen here, went on to become the F-104A and all the way up through the F-104G, ultimately served with NATO, became a successful interceptor in its own right. Beautiful night study of an engine run-up and full burner at Palmdale. And there were some concepts that didn't fly. We should mention the Republic XF-103 Thunder Warrior. This was an all-titanium Mach 3 interceptor, but it was in the early 50s. It was just too much, too soon. And 10 years later, the Lockheed team, under the guidance of the brilliant Kelly Johnson, developed the YF-12, which became part of the Blackbird family. North American had the XF-108 Rapier. This was kind of the little brother to the XB-70 Valkyrie, but again, only made it to the mock-up stage and never went into production. So there you have the X-Fighters, but as Columbo says, just one more thing. For you sharp-eyed viewers that picked up on the fact that the upper left photo is a bomber, yes, that's the Martin XB-51 Trijet, but this airplane gets honorable mention because it was featured in the movie Toward the Unknown in 1956 as the Gilbert XF-120 fighter. For you bomber fans, we'll be doing X-Bombers in a future episode of Celebrating Aviation. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and thank you so much for Celebrating Aviation with Mike Machat. Special thanks to some wonderful folks who helped make this possible. And if you enjoyed this channel, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that 707 at lower right. We'd love to have you on board. See you next time.